It was just past evensong when the Honourable Harriet Compton, spinster of Uxley-under-Wold and widow of a bishop's chaplain, rang the vestry bell with unnecessary violence and demanded of the startled verger whether the Reverend Henry Beddoe had taken leave of his senses, or if he was merely entertaining corpses on the North Green. The verger, who had not yet changed from his robes and was still chewing a clove of boiled sweet from the offertory tin, blinked and said something about the usual state of decay in the parishioners. "No," said Miss Compton, eyes bright behind pince-nez. "Not metaphorical corpses, not your Mr. Eglinton of the gouty toe, or Mrs. Foskett of the endless confession. I mean an actual man in a velvet coat, quite unmistakably dead these 7 years, standing at the edge of my rose border and smoking what appeared to be a Turkish cigarette." The verger, being a man of God's patience but limited imagination, asked gently if she had perhaps mistaken a scarecrow or an itinerant actor for her long-deceased neighbour. "That is precisely the trouble," said Miss Compton with icy precision. "He was an actor, Edmund Hargreaves, drowned at sea, 1925, his memorial's in the churchyard. I helped arrange the lilies myself, and yet there he was, smoking, smiling, and saying I'd grown no older. The nerve." By the time the matter reached the drawing-room of Uxley Hall the following morning, it had ripened considerably. The man had not only smoked, but hummed a tune from the Merry Widow. He had tipped his hat to a cat whom no one remembered owning. He had vanished behind the yew hedge, leaving, most disturbingly, a Turkish cigarette still warm on the sundial. Lady Bedlington, hearing the tale retold over weak Darjeeling and watercress sandwiches, gave a sigh and declared the affair beastly continental. Her husband, the Earl, muttered something about opium dens and trouble in Brighton. The village postmaster claimed to have seen a similar man asking directions to the vicarage, but I paid him no mind, what with the goose raffle and the telegram to Hull. And so it might have ended, as these things often do, in whispers, suspicious glances, and some vague resolution to speak to the bishop. But the matter took a decidedly less pastoral turn on Wednesday morning, when the vicar's dog, a cynical terrier named St. Augustine, unearthed a human hand in the vicarage garden, gripping a silver locket and entirely lacking a body. The newspapers, of course, were quick to turn up in force. The Daily Yell declared it a case of ghost murder in Churchyard Village. The Times, more reserved, noted with restrained interest the locket's monogram, E.H., still legible. It was at this point that Lord Peter Death Breden Wimsey, fresh from a tiresome committee on the standardization of library cataloguing and suffering a deep malaise from the indifferent soul at his club, received a short note on thick ivory paper from his friend Chief Inspector Parker. "Uxley-under-Wold, hand found in vicar's turnips. The dead man may be a famous actor, 7 years dead, possible resurrection. You like this sort of thing. Kindly apply your intelligence." Wimsey read the note thrice, stared at the corner of his ceiling, which he felt had been painted with too much confidence, and rang for Bunter. "Pack the brown tweeds and the heavy coat, Bunter. I fancy we may be travelling to a place where the dead have a regrettable habit of returning. Also, have we any knowledge of Turkish cigarettes favoured by the theatrical profession circa 1920? "I shall inquire discreetly, my lord," said Bunter, with the faintest tremor of interest. "And Bunter, see if you can locate a copy of The Merry Widow. I should like to arrive with the tune already stuck in my head." Lord Peter Wimsey arrived in Uxley-under-Wold the following afternoon, trailing mild scandal, pipe smoke, and the vague scent of leather-bound books. He was received politely but with unease. A titled man asking questions was one thing, but a titled man with spats, 3 umbrellas, and an obsession with curtain rods was quite another. He examined the locket, he examined the hand, He asked the vicar if his turnips had grown unusually well this year, and whether they had been manured with anything peculiar. He peered at the sundial and muttered something about shadows and solstices. He asked if the ghost had spoken in iambic pentameter, or merely hummed it. "Lord Peter," said the vicar at last, "do you suppose it was a ghost, or a hoax?" Wimsey smiled thinly. "I suppose, dear vicar, that someone rather wants us to believe in ghosts, which makes one wonder what they're hiding beneath the sheet." He turned then, quite suddenly, to the village constable. "How long would you say it takes to walk from the rose border to the yew hedge? Precisely, mind you. And whether a man might vanish in 8 seconds without benefit of witchcraft?" The constable began to stammer something about footpaths and shadows, but Wimsey was already halfway across the lawn, measuring paces with the precision of a surveyor and tapping at the sundial with his cane. "Curious," he murmured. "Quite curious. This sundial is fast, by, nearly 13 minutes. Lady Bedlington, who had come out in a lilac shawl, frowned. "Surely that's nothing?" "No doubt," said Wimsey, with bright eyes. "Just a triviality, a trifle, like a hand in the turnips. But trifle by trifle, my lady, the dead do whisper, rather loudly." And with that he turned, grinning, and went to tea. Lord Peter Wimsey had once observed that the real heart of an English village resided not in its drawing-rooms or chapels, but in its kitchens, preferably among copper-pot, boiled kettles, and servants with sharp tongues and sharper recollections. And so, having exhausted the charms of the sundial and measured the yew hedge with the zeal of a fencing master, he repaired, by way of a gentle detour and 3 idle remarks about Lady Bedlington's geraniums, to the servants' hall of Uxley Hall. Mrs. Paget, the housekeeper, was a woman of formidable apron and minimal illusions. She had served under 4 earls and once refused to admit a bishop on the grounds that he reeked of damp and improper onions. She regarded Wimsey with the wary tolerance afforded to noblemen who asked questions instead of giving orders. "I dare say you've had visitors enough of late," said Wimsey, warming his long fingers around a mug of something not quite tea and not quite broth. "Ghosts, hands, the usual parish amusements." Mrs. Paget gave a sniff. "The living's worse than the dead, if you ask me. Least the dead don't leave ash on the carpet or call the undergardener a continental insect." Wimsey's eyebrows tilted. "Someone called your undergardener that?" "Tuesday last. Stranger came up to the tradesman's door all swagger and polish, asked for the Earl, bold as brass, and said he'd just come from Montefiammingolo. Henry, that's the boy, offered to fetch someone, and the man said, 'Don't trouble yourself, little insect,' and lit a Turkish cigarette like it were the Savoy." "Tuesday," murmured Wimsey, producing his little notebook with the same reverence he afforded to Pindar's odes. "And would this be before or after the appearance of our most theatrical ghost?" "Day before, I'd say, or 2, I lose track." She hesitated, her expression clouding faintly. "Though I did think he looked a bit off, if you see what I mean." "Off in what way, Mrs. Paget?" "Sort of waxy, shiny forehead, but his clothes were right. Looked like he'd stepped out of a newsreel, velvet collar, silk cravat. But I couldn't quite place the voice. Like someone doing an impression, if you understand." "Imitating the dead," said Wimsey softly. "How frightfully modern." He closed the notebook with a snap and stood. "One last question, if I may. Has anyone been inquiring about the vicarage garden, specifically the turnip beds?" Mrs. Paget frowned. "Only old Mr. Ponsonby, who claims the ghost flattened his marrow, but he's been odd since 1916. Other than that, no." Outside, the wind stirred along the gravel paths with the polite persistence of a guest too shy to knock. Wimsey turned up his coat collar and strolled toward the vicarage. The Reverend Beddoe, thin as a cassock and twice as creased, met him with the embarrassed hospitality reserved for those who turn up asking about severed limbs. He ushered Wimsey through to the conservatory, where a tray of untouched lemon biscuits languished beside a copy of the Church Times. "I assure you," said Beddoe, "that I've never seen the man before, nor has St. Augustine, and he's an excellent judge of character." Wimsey regarded the terrier, who lay snoring with one ear twitching at intervals. "Indeed, and when did you last observe the turnip bed before this little archaeological revelation?" "Monday evening, just before dusk. I was planting out winter kale." Wimsey nodded. "So the hand appeared between Monday evening and Wednesday morning. Curious timing, no?" The vicar hesitated. "Well, there was a noise Tuesday night, about 10 o'clock, a rustling. I thought it might be a fox, but it might have been a resurrectionist," said Wimsey, rising. The vicar flushed. "This is hardly Burke and Hare territory, Lord Peter." "No," said Wimsey mildly. "Merely the Cotswolds, where ghosts return wearing foreign cigarettes and lost actors drop their hands in the rhubarb." He returned through the village by the side lane, passing the churchyard where Edmund Hargreaves's memorial stood in crisp stone, lost at sea, 1925. Mourned by all who knew him. There was something slightly smug about the epitaph, Wimsey thought, as though Hargreaves himself had written it in advance, possibly in iambic pentameter. Back at the inn, Bunter met him with a quiet nod and a folded sheet of paper. "You were right, my lord. The cigarette stub found on the sundial is a Monrepo Egyptian brand, imported through Nice, very fashionable among Riviera performers in the early 20s. There are no legal importers in the UK as of last year, but there's a small tobacconist in Brighton who still has some in stock. He recalled a man purchasing 2 cartons last week under the name E. Hargreaves." Wimsey took the paper and stared at it a long moment. "E. Hargreaves. Either we are being haunted, Bunter, or someone is going to absurd lengths to impersonate the dead." "Indeed, my lord. And which do you suppose it is?" "I am inclined to the absurd, my lord." "As am I," said Wimsey, standing and stretching. "Let's have a look at the parish register tomorrow morning, followed by the post office receipts, the stonemason's records, and the late Mr. Hargreaves's will, if we may prevail upon Lady Bedlington's legal files." Bunter raised an eyebrow. "You believe the answer lies in the paperwork?" "No, Bunter, I believe the answer lies in the timing of the paperwork, as always." That night, long after the inn had shuttered and the wind set the chimney sighing like a forgotten lover, Wimsey sat at the writing desk with the lamplight gold upon his collar, mapping the days. Monday, no hand, no ghost. Tuesday morning, stranger at the tradesman's door. Tuesday night, rustling in the vicarage garden. Wednesday morning, hand discovered. Thursday, Wimsey arrives. It all lined up too neatly. One resurrection, one impersonation, one missing body, and a man who died twice. Wimsey stared at the timeline a moment longer, then made a small sound, half laugh, half sigh, and murmured, "Only one thing could tie it all together. Only one. Reason for the ghost to return before the will is red." And with that, he blew out the lamp. Morning came to Uxley-under-Wold beneath a dome of pearl-grey clouds which hung low over the fields, as though brooding on what they'd overheard. Lord Peter Wimsey, having dined frugally on poached egg and the village inn's interpretation of toast, took his gloves, cane, and an appetite for discrepancies, and made his way to the rectory. The parish registers were not in the vicar's keeping as it happened, but in the small vestry archive behind St. Margaret's chancel, kept in a battered oak cabinet that smelt of linseed oil damp hymnals, and old paperbacks about missionary zeal in Rangoon. Reverend Beddoe provided the key with mild concern. "You won't find anything ghostly in them, I fear." "On the contrary," said Wimsey cheerfully, "the best ghosts are made of ink and administrative errors." The entries for 1925 were neat, written in two alternating hands. One recorded the death of Edmund Hargreaves, presumed drowned following maritime accident, Mediterranean route, dated July 17, 1925, entered by the previous vicar. No body had ever been recovered, only a telegram from Marseille and a solicitor's letter confirming the loss of the SS Calabrian Star. Curiously, another entry followed 2 weeks later, memorial service held by request of the widow, Miss Jane Felversham, fiancée to the deceased. "Fiancée, not wife," Wimsey murmured. "No marriage, no issue. No legal entanglements, save perhaps, the will he made for the Bedlington estate, where the Earl's man of business, one Mr. Redbridge, kept a tidy office in a dusty turret room that overlooked a chessboard garden now gone to drowsy seed. "I believe the will was managed by your predecessor, sir," Redbridge said, leafing through a stack of folded folios tied in the charmingly obsolete manner with green silk ribbon. "But the summary is here. Hargreaves left his estate, what little remained after debts and a languid tour of the Riviera, to his cousin Lionel Hargreaves, actor of middling repute, said to be his understudy at one point, never amounted to much, died in Bournemouth in 31, influenza." Wimsey nodded slowly. "No other claimants?" "There was talk of a half-sister in Italy, but it came to nothing. She'd died the year before, apparently. The family were dreadful record-keepers." "Indeed," said Wimsey. "And the memorial?" "Arranged by Miss Felversham, paid for it herself. She was quite determined." The name stirred something faintly in Wimsey's memory, a newspaper clipping perhaps, or a gossip column from years past. He made a note of it and asked if Redbridge would be so kind as to produce any receipts or documentation from the funeral monument itself. "Odd," Redbridge said, sifting through the folder. "There was a correction made on the stone at some point. Oh yes, here we are. Originally it read, 'Beloved son Edmund Hargreaves born, 1892, lost at sea, 1925. But Miss Felversham objected. Had the year of birth removed, something about ambiguity. Wimsey's mouth twitched. Indeed, ambiguity is often rather helpful when one hopes to fake a death, for example. Redbridge gave him a startled look, but Wimsey had already taken up his hat. "You've been most obliging. Tell me, do you have any photographs of the late Mr. Hargreaves?" "A few old headshots, theatrical things. I can have them sent round." "Please do. And any of his cousin Lionel, if you've got them." Wimsey walked back through the village, thoughts ticking behind his gaze. A ghost in velvet, a foreign cigarette, a severed hand clutching a locket, all evocative, but it was the error in the inscription that troubled him most. The hand had worn no rings, bore no tattoos or markings, only the initials in the locket tied it to Edmund Hargreaves, and even that had been suspiciously convenient. If someone had wanted the village to believe the ghost had returned, there were better ways to do it than merely appearing in the twilight. No, this had been deliberate. The ghost was meant to be seen by Miss Compton, no less, who knew the man by sight. So if the hand belonged to the real Hargreaves, whose voice had Miss Compton heard on Tuesday, and if the real Hargreaves was dead, why did someone go to such effort to impersonate him after the fact? The postmistress was next, one Miss Bess Willoughby, whose hands moved with mechanical precision and whose memory could recall the precise spelling of surnames at 6 paces. "Yes," she said, upon being presented with the name. "There was a telegram sent from London last Friday to Miss Felversham." "Care of Uxley Hall?" Wimsey paused. Miss Felversham is here, in the village? She's been at the hall since last week. Arrived in mourning, said she needed to pay respects to the grave. Wimsey's tone remained pleasant. And when did you last see her? Yesterday morning, early. She posted a parcel. Foreign label. Italy, I think. Foreign postage, sudden arrival, a name on the headstone that now refused to lie quietly underground. Wimsey left the post office with a light step and a heavy suspicion. By the time he reached the village green, the sun was beginning to press faintly through the clouds, casting pale shadows over the memorial stones. He turned sharply down the lane toward Uxley Hall. Lady Bedlington, smelling faintly of beeswax and defiance, received him in the drawing-room with an expression that hovered between amusement and caution. "Felversham?" she said, lifting an eyebrow. "Charming girl once. Grew rather intense after Edmund's death. She came to stay out of the blue, asked for her old room. I confess I found her somewhat brittle. She's out walking, I believe, around the meadow." Wimsey bowed. "Would you object terribly if I borrowed one of your staff for a moment?" "Oh, take whoever you like, dear man, as long as you don't expect them back cleaner than you found them." Mrs. Paget was summoned again, this time to confirm the parcel. Yes, Miss Felversham had handed it off herself. No idea what was in it. Wrapped like a gift, not like post. Quite heavy. "And before that?" Wimsey inquired. "Did she seem troubled?" "More like rehearsed," Mrs. Paget said grimly. "She always had a way of standing in doorways like she was waiting for her cue." That afternoon, the photographs arrived from the solicitor. 2 identical men, perhaps cousins, perhaps not. Both dark-haired, with thin, stage-friendly features, and that peculiar blend of arrogance and longing particular to the unsuccessful actor. One photo was signed in neat ink. "To Jane, with all my heart, Edmund." But it was the other that caught Wimsey's attention. The man's hair was parted differently, and the cigarette in his fingers was not Turkish, but a local brand, Red Craven. He sat back and said half to himself, if the real Hargreaves died in 1925 and Lionel inherited everything, why impersonate the cousin now? Why the ghost, the locket, the hand? Unless Lionel Hargreaves had not died in 1931, after all. Unless it was Edmund who had lived and staged his own death to escape debt, a failed engagement, or both. And Lionel who had perished, perhaps unknowingly sacrificing more than an inheritance, which meant the man seen in Uxley wasn't a ghost. He was a man who'd already died once and now needed to die again if the truth were ever to be buried. And perhaps Miss Felversham, after 7 years of silence, had come back to see which of them was really dead. Would you like me to continue directly with the next section? Morning came to Uxley under Wold beneath a dome of pearl-grey clouds which hung low over the fields as though brooding on what they'd overheard. Lord Peter Wimsey, having dined frugally on poached egg and the village inn's interpretation of toast, took his gloves, cane, and an appetite for discrepancies, and made his way to the rectory. The parish registers were not in the vicar's keeping as it happened, but in the small vestry archive behind St. Margaret's chancel, kept in a battered oak cabinet that smelt of linseed oil, damp hymnals, and old paperbacks about missionary zeal in Rangoon. Reverend Beddoe provided the key with mild concern. "You won't find anything ghostly in them, I fear." "On the contrary," said Wimsey, cheerfully, "the best ghosts are made of ink and administrative errors. The entries for 1925 were neat, written in 2 alternating hands. One recorded the death of Edmund Hargreaves, presumed drowned, following maritime accident Mediterranean route, dated July 17, 1925, entered by the previous vicar. No body had ever been recovered, only a telegram from Marseille and a solicitor's letter confirming the loss of the SS Calabrian star. Curiously, another entry followed 2 weeks later. Memorial service held by request of the widow, Miss Jane Felversham, fiancée to the deceased. Fiancée, not wife, Wimsey murmured. No marriage, no issue, no legal entanglements, save perhaps, the will he made for the Bedlington estate, where the Earl's man of business, one Mr. Redbridge, kept a tidy office in a dusty turret room that overlooked a chessboard garden now gone to drowsy seed. I believe the will was managed by your predecessor, sir, Redbridge said, leafing through a stack of folded folios tied in the charmingly obsolete manner with green silk ribbon. But the summary is here. Hargreaves left his estate, what little remained after debts and a languid tour of the Riviera, to his cousin, Lionel Hargreaves, actor of middling repute, said to be his understudy at one point, never amounted to much, died in Bournemouth in 31. Influenza. Wimsey nodded slowly. No other claimants? There was talk of a half-sister in Italy, but it came to nothing. She'd died the year before, apparently. The family were dreadful record-keepers. Indeed, said Wimsey. And the memorial? Arranged by Miss Felversham. Paid for it herself. She was quite determined. The name stirred something faintly in Wimsey's memory. A newspaper clipping, perhaps, or a gossip column from years past. He made a note of it and asked if Redbridge would be so kind as to produce any receipts or documentation from the funeral monument itself. Odd, Redbridge said, sifting through the folder. There was a correction made on the stone at some point. Oh yes, here we are. Originally it read beloved son Edmund Hargreaves, born 1892, lost at sea 1925, but Miss Felversham objected. Had the year of birth removed, something about ambiguity. Wimsey's mouth twitched. Indeed, ambiguity is often rather helpful when one hopes to fake a death, for example. Redbridge gave him a startled look, but Wimsey had already taken up his hat. You've been most obliging. Tell me, do you have any photographs of the late Mr. Hargreaves? A few old headshots, theatrical things. I can have them sent round. Please do, and any of his cousin Lionel if you've got them. Wimsey walked back through the village, thoughts ticking behind his gaze. A ghost in velvet, a foreign cigarette, a severed hand clutching a locket, all evocative, but it was the error in the inscription that troubled him most. The hand had worn no rings, bore no tattoos or markings, only the initials in the locket tied it to Edmund Hargreaves, and even that had been suspiciously convenient. If someone had wanted the village to believe the ghost had returned, there were better ways to do it than merely appearing in the twilight. No, this had been deliberate. The ghost was meant to be seen, by Miss Compton no less, who knew the man by sight. So if the hand belonged to the real Hargreaves, whose voice had Miss Compton heard on Tuesday? And if the real Hargreaves was dead, why did someone go to such effort to impersonate him after the fact? The postmistress was next, one Miss Bess Willoughby, whose hands moved with mechanical precision and whose memory could recall the precise spelling of surnames at 6 paces. Yes, she said, upon being presented with the name. There was a telegram sent from London last Friday. To Miss Felversham, care of Uxley Hall. Wimsey paused. Miss Felversham is here? In the village? She's been at the hall since last week. Arrived in morning. Said she needed to pay respects to the grave. Wimsey's tone remained pleasant. And when did you last see her? Yesterday morning. Early. She posted a parcel, foreign label, Italy, I think. Foreign postage, sudden arrival, a name on the headstone that now refused to lie quietly underground. Wimsey left the post office with a light step and a heavy suspicion. By the time he reached the village green, the sun was beginning to press faintly through the clouds, casting pale shadows over the memorial stones. He turned sharply down the lane toward Uxley Hall. Lady Bedlington, smelling faintly of beeswax and defiance, received him in the drawing-room with an expression that hovered between amusement and caution. "Felversham?" she said, lifting an eyebrow. "Charming girl once, grew rather intense after Edmund's death. She came to stay out of the blue, asked for her old room. I confess I found her somewhat brittle. She's out walking, I believe, around the meadow." Wimsey bowed. "Would you object terribly if I borrowed one of your staff for a moment?" "Oh, take whoever you like, dear man, as long as you don't expect them back cleaner than you found them." Mrs. Paget was summoned again, this time to confirm the parcel. Yes, Miss Felversham had handed it off herself. No idea what was in it. Wrapped like a gift, not like post. Quite heavy. "And before that?" Wimsey inquired. "Did she seem troubled?" "More like rehearsed," Mrs. Paget said grimly. "She always had a way of standing in doorways like she was waiting for her cue." That afternoon, the photographs arrived from the solicitor. 2 identical men, perhaps cousins, perhaps not. Both dark-haired, with thin, stage-friendly features, and that peculiar blend of arrogance and longing particular to the unsuccessful actor. One photo was signed in neat ink, "To Jane, with all my heart, Edmund." But it was the other that caught Wimsey's attention. The man's hair was parted differently, and the cigarette in his fingers was not Turkish, but a local brand, Red Craven. He sat back and said, half to himself, "If the real Hargreaves died in 1925 and Lionel inherited everything, why impersonate the cousin now? Why the ghost, the locket, the hand? Unless Lionel Hargreaves had not died in 1931, after all. Unless it was Edmund who had lived and staged his own death to escape debt, a failed engagement, or both. And Lionel who had perished, perhaps unknowingly sacrificing more than an inheritance. Which meant the man seen in Uxley wasn't a ghost. He was a man who'd already died once, and now needed to die again, if the truth were ever to be buried. And perhaps Miss Felversham, after 7 years of silence, had come back to see which of them was really dead. The next morning, Wimsey was back at Uxley Hall before breakfast, inspecting the long, narrow study where Lionel Hargreaves had supposedly breathed his last. The room was a modest affair, cluttered with faded scripts, cracked photographs, and a faintly sour smell of tobacco and old sweat. Lady Bedlington had left a modest fire burning, and the curtains were drawn tight against the cold. Wimsey's eyes drifted to the clock on the mantelpiece, a rather battered English oak affair, its hands frozen at 7:18. "Most clocks are liars by nature," he mused aloud, "but some tell us the truth about the inconvenient moments when life turns." He beckoned Bunter to measure the room's dimensions, and noted the position of the single window which overlooked the garden labyrinth. "If Lionel died here," Wimsey said thoughtfully, "then how came it that no one heard the struggle, no cries for help, no sign of entry or exit other than this window?" Lady Bedlington, who had entered quietly, raised a delicate eyebrow. "It was said he died of influenza, my lord. No struggle, no violence, merely a lingering illness." "Influenza," Wimsey repeated, tapping the locket found with the hand. "Yet our ghost carries this with such theatrical aplomb. There is a stage here, indeed, but whose?" Wimsey then questioned the servants in turn. The cook recalled hearing strange footsteps on the night of Lionel's death. The maid remembered a visitor arriving late that evening, a man no one recognized, wrapped in a velvet coat. The butler, whose face was a map of decades and secrets, muttered something about a wrong man paying the ultimate price. The puzzle was deepening. Wimsey speculated aloud on the likelihood of a staged death, a performance designed to fool the world and perhaps the actors themselves. But who was the author, Edmund or Lionel? Later, a telegram arrived for the household from London, addressed to Miss Jane Felversham. It was brief and cryptic. "Return at once." The past does not rest. Wimsey smiled thinly. A summons or a threat? And a reminder that in mysteries, the dead are rarely as silent as we wish. He resolved to visit Miss Felversham on her return and confront the tangled skein of identities, motives, and secrets that now haunted Uxley-under-Wold. Lord Peter Wimsey awaited Miss Felversham's return with a patience born of long acquaintance with the folly of haste. When at last the evening shadows lengthened and the sound of a carriage crunching gravel announced her arrival, he found her standing in the dimly lit hall, draped in black, her eyes sharp but guarded. "Miss Felversham," Wimsey began with gentle formality, "I trust your journey was not too arduous?" She inclined her head. "Far from it, Lord Peter. London's fog and my thoughts were both dense, but one survives." Wimsey studied her closely. There was a steel beneath the sorrow, a calculation behind the grief. "I understand you wish to pay respects to Edmund. May I ask, do you believe he is truly lost to us?" She hesitated, then spoke with a quiet intensity. "Lost? Perhaps, but I suspect that the man we all mourned is not quite the man he seemed." A soft footfall drew their attention. Bunter appeared, carrying a small bundle of papers and a faded photograph. "Forgive the interruption, Miss Felversham. I thought these might interest you." He handed the items over. Among the papers was a letter, brittle with age, addressed to Edmund from an Italian lawyer. The letter hinted at a pending inheritance and a family secret concealed for decades. The photograph was of a young woman strikingly like Jane herself, but dated years before. Wimsey exchanged a glance with Jane. "It appears there are shadows in this story, longer than any of us anticipated." Jane's voice was steady. "There is a part of Edmund's past he never shared, perhaps because it would have undone everything he hoped to leave behind." Wimsey's mind raced. The hand, the ghostly appearances, the locket, they were all threads in a tapestry of deception and self-preservation. "Miss Felversham," Wimsey said gently, "might I inquire if you know more about the man who visited Uxley before your arrival? The one seen at the tradesman's door?" Jane's eyes flickered. "I know of him. A man who should have been dead long ago." A chill settled in the room, as if the past itself had taken a breath. Wimsey took his leave from Miss Felversham, not long after that revelation, though her final words rang in his mind like a bell in a silent cathedral. A man who should have been dead long ago. The next morning he travelled to Oxford, where old college records and university gossip could be counted on to reveal the more enduring skeletons of England's respectable families. Over brandy, with an archivist of uncertain loyalty to confidentiality, Wimsey discovered that Lionel Hargreaves had, in the year before his supposed death, suffered a very public disgrace, a plagiarism scandal involving a minor play, which had quietly been suppressed at the time. But what was more interesting than the scandal itself was the timing, a month before Lionel's influenza death. The record of that death, Wimsey noted, was scant and largely built upon the testimony of a single physician, an acquaintance of the Bedlington family, now conveniently dead. Back at Uxley, Wimsey found that the constable had returned from the forensic analysis of the severed hand. The result, though preliminary, was striking. The hand did not belong to Edmund Bedlington, or indeed to anyone recorded in the local registries. It was the hand of a stranger, male, aged roughly between 45 and 55. The fingers bore traces of chemical exposure, and beneath one nail there was residue of stage makeup. stage makeup. Wimsey rubbed his temple, the pattern sharpening. At that moment, Bunter entered with news. "My lord, the gardener's boy swears he saw someone moving through the maze early this morning, wearing a coat far too fine for garden work." They moved at once to the maze. Wimsey, as always, led not by impulse but by inference. If the maze were used as a hiding place, or better yet, as a means of movement undetected, it would offer ample cover for someone clever enough to make use of it. Within 20 minutes, they had found what they were looking for: a false panel set into the outer hedge, behind which a narrow path led to an old root cellar, long thought disused. Inside, half collapsed and reeking of damp, were a cloak, a bottle of spirits, and several copies of Edmund's handwriting practice sheets. "Practice," Wimsey said aloud. "Of course, because the letters that came after his death had to be written in a perfect simulacrum of his hand." Bunter's brow furrowed. "But who, my lord?" Wimsey held up one of the sheets. "Only one man would know Edmund's hand well enough to forge it. Someone who had copied it as a brother, perhaps, or studied it as a rival." And then it struck him. Not Lionel Hargreaves as victim, but as architect. It was just after sunset when Lord Peter Wimsey returned once more to Bedlington House, the air thick with that late autumn stillness that makes every creaking floorboard sound like thunder. He requested, with deliberate politeness, that Lady Ursula gather the household in the drawing-room. Her expression flickered just briefly before she consented. They assembled like pieces on a chessboard, Ursula with a fraying shawl tight over her shoulders, George Bedlington, silent and grey at the edges, Miss Felversham observing with an unreadable calm, the housekeeper, Mrs. Baines, and even young Robert, who looked increasingly nervous in Wimsey's presence. Bunter, loyal as ever, stood near the fireplace, pen poised. Wimsey took no seat. "I have, I believe, discovered the final contours of this curious affair," he began, brushing specks of lint from his cuff. "A puzzle of inheritance, revenge, mistaken identity, or perhaps not mistaken, but rather manufactured, and one exceedingly well-trimmed hedge maze." He paced the length of the room, his tone unhurried, almost languid. "We have, of course, the unfortunate death, or presumed death, of Edmund Bedlington, followed by strange letters from him, a severed hand found in the orchard, and beneath it all, a house bent into silence by the weight of history." Ursula exhaled sharply as if she meant to speak, but Wimsey held up a hand. What is death, after all, if not a convenient tool? Lionel Hargreaves, as it happens, did not die of influenza, nor of shame. He vanished, perhaps with the quiet complicity of his family. Perhaps not. What we know is this: a man named Edmund Bedlington spent the years that followed abroad, but who returned? He turned, locking eyes with George. "You returned," he said softly. Or rather, Lionel returned, the brother with a ruined name, assuming the identity of the one who still held honor, title, and inheritance. George Bedlington went white. "That's a vile accusation," he rasped, "and a false one." "No," Wimsey replied, almost kindly. "It is the only one that fits all the facts, the handwriting on the letters, the theatrical background implied by the stage makeup, the forgeries, the voice in the hall, yours, not Edmund's. The man who returned here after all those years was not Edmund, but Lionel Hargreaves, wearing his brother's name like a second skin." The room was utterly still. Only the wind scratched faintly at the leaded windows. "Edmund's death, I surmise, occurred many years ago, perhaps in the East, perhaps in some squalid little accident, and Lionel, seizing the opportunity, stepped into the role. He rehearsed it even, hence the handwriting practice in the cellar." Miss Felversham spoke then, her voice low. "That's why he asked me about Edmund's habits. He was afraid someone might notice a difference." Wimsey nodded. The deception might have continued indefinitely had it not been for one unfortunate factor. Edmund had enemies, debts, disputes. Someone, perhaps an old creditor, perhaps a discarded mistress, recognized the truth. Blackmail followed, that much we find in the letters. He withdrew a small envelope from his coat. This letter, found in the root cellar, was unsigned but damning. "I know what you did," it says. And so does the man in the portrait. A threat, a demand for silence or payment. When that failed, they came here to confront you. There was a struggle and you killed him. George Bedlington had risen from his chair, breathing heavily now, hands trembling. Wimsey's voice did not change. "You buried the body. You removed the hand and burned it, thinking it unidentifiable. But that very act doomed you, for it was the hand of the real Edmund Bedlington, the brother you replaced. The silence that followed was not sudden. It was slow, creeping like fog along a field. George's knees buckled. He fell back into his chair, staring not at Wimsey, but at the fire. Lady Ursula did not weep. She sat with eyes closed, as though listening for the echo of a lie told long ago. Wimsey turned away at last. "Bunter, I believe the constable will wish to be summoned." The drawing-room emptied with the hush of a church after vespers. Bunter had left to contact the local constabulary, moving with his characteristic, silent precision. The household dispersed, Lady Ursula assisted by Miss Felversham, who offered no words but a steadying hand. Robert disappearing somewhere into the long corridors of Bedlington House, his face stricken with something deeper than fear. Only Wimsey remained behind, lingering before the hearth, where embers now pulsed like dim eyes in the grate. He tapped the mantelpiece with a long finger. Lionel Hargreaves had killed a man, perhaps more than one, in truth, and then killed himself in spirit long before the deed was done. The tragedy was not in the crime, but in the centuries of pride that had made it possible. A family folding itself into illusion again and again until no one quite remembered where the truth had gone missing. Footsteps on tile announced the constable's arrival. Inspector Tolliver, ruddy-cheeked and tired-looking, entered with an air of authority and a clear reluctance to involve himself in matters involving titled suspects. "You're certain of the facts, my lord?" Tolliver asked, after Wimsey had laid out the sequence, every point punctuated with maddening clarity. "As certain as one can be when most of the evidence has already been buried, burned, or inherited," Wimsey replied. "But the confession, I imagine, will come readily enough. Mr. Bedlington has been living in borrowed skin far too long. The seams have burst." Tolliver's mouth worked at a reply, but found none. He merely nodded, removed his cap, and departed to begin the official grim work. Wimsey turned away from the door. He had expected no triumph. There was no tidy knot to tie here, no clean applause from the universe. A man had been killed, a name had been stolen. But worse, far worse, a lineage had devoured itself with no one left to mourn the loss. He stepped into the corridor and found himself, by instinct rather than intent, walking toward the portrait gallery. The corridor was long and unlit, and he moved with only the candlelight behind him to edge the frames. The faces stared back, lords and ladies in oil and gold leaf, hollow eyes watching their descendant fall to ruin. At the very end, the two most recent portraits faced each other like sentinels. One, the man known to all as Edmund, serious, composed, with that particular expression of English aloofness cultivated at the better public schools. The other, in a more modern hand, was George, seated beside a greyhound, and holding a hunting rifle he'd likely never fired. But as Wimsey looked longer, the illusion broke. The so-called Edmund's eyes were Lionel's, and Lionel had always been an actor. It was the same turn of the jaw, the same discomfort around the collar, the same slant to the brow when hiding some inner storm. He had not fooled the canvas, only the living. A soft rustle behind him made him turn. It was Miss Felversham, a shawl drawn around her shoulders, her face pale in the thin light. "I thought I might find you here," she said, voice low. "I'm often drawn to portraits after murder," Wimsey replied dryly. "They always seem to have known." She stepped beside him, hands clasped before her. "Do you believe he meant to kill him, the man who blackmailed him?" Wimsey sighed. "Number, I think it was panic. Or pride, or shame, though in men like him those are nearly indistinguishable. It was not premeditated, but it was final, all the same." They stood in silence. "I always wondered why he flinched when we mentioned the theatre," she murmured, "or when I spoke of Edmund's letters from Bombay. I thought it was grief. Now I realize it was fear someone would catch the slip." "He played the part too well," Wimsey said. "He became the ghost of his brother, only to be haunted by the man he pretended to be." Miss Felversham turned, studying Wimsey with a quiet sadness. "And what becomes of the house now?" "That's for the Crown to decide, I suppose, or some distant cousin, but it will never be quite the same. Too many shadows." She nodded slowly. "Will you stay the night?" Wimsey gave a tired smile. "I think I shall decline. Bunter and I will take the road before midnight. There's a moon. And I've had my fill of echoing halls and locked doors." Miss Felversham held out her hand. "Then thank you for seeing the truth, even when we didn't wish to." He took her hand gently. "The truth," he said, "has a dreadful habit of showing up whether one wants it or not." And with that he turned, walking back down the corridor, his silhouette long and slanting across the ancestral faces of Bedlington House. Behind him, the great estate stood as it always had, still beautiful and broken beneath the weight of its own memory. The next morning broke pale and washed in mist, the gardens of Bedlington House fading into a grey indistinctness, as if the estate were trying to erase itself from memory. Lord Peter Wimsey sat quietly in the morning room, untouched toast on his plate, a single sheet of folded paper beside the teacup he had not yet lifted. Bunter, ever composed, stood at the window, eyes fixed on the carriage road, as though awaiting the return of something not bound to arrive. "Letters, my lord," said Bunter, breaking the stillness at last and placing a silver tray on the side table. "One from Parker." "Ah," said Wimsey with interest, lifting the letter. "The man has timing as precise as your ironing." He opened the envelope with a thin blade, scanning the page. His brows lifted slightly. "Parker confirms it. Lionel Hargreaves served 2 years with a repertory company under the name L. Treville. Rather dismal reviews, poor chap, but thorough records. Toured through Norwich, Chichester, Brighton, then vanished around 1924. He folded the letter again and let it rest on his lap. "That," he said softly, "would be just about the time Edmund was last heard from in India. The dates are too neat to ignore." Bunter nodded solemnly. "A timely disappearance and a convenient reappearance as Lord Bedlington." Wimsey rose, walking to the fireplace, though it bore no fire, only the scent of old ash. "And the blackmailer?" he asked. "Any word?" "Inspector Tolliver located the man's lodgings," Bunter replied, "under the name of Mr. Gerald Pierce, though that too was false, apparently known to the police in Kent and elsewhere under more than one alias. Confidence work, forgeries, discreet extortion. There are connections to a rather sordid ring in London. It seems our Mr. Pierce had learned of Lionel's imposture by chance, an old playbill found by a former stagehand." Wimsey's mouth curved downward. "So much for noble silence. He saw a family secret and thought, what a lovely purse that would make. He glanced at the blank hearth once more, the coldness of the room matching something deep in his chest. It had never been about justice, not for the blackmailer, nor even for Lionel. It had been about identity. A man trying so hard to belong that he murdered the past to claim the present. And yet, the past had come knocking anyway. Later that afternoon, he walked once more through the grounds. Bedlington House loomed like a fortress on a hill, its windows shuttered against the light, its stone walls bearing centuries of proud decay. He wandered until he reached the stables, long unused save for the occasional garden cart. There, surprisingly, he found Robert Bedlington. The young man leaned against a stall door, sleeves rolled up, hands flecked with dirt. He did not look up when Wimsey entered. "I suppose," Robert said at last, "you've come to say something wise." "I try to ration my wisdom," said Wimsey. "I've found people tire of it rather quickly." Robert managed a bleak smile. "What happens now?" "That depends," Wimsey replied gently, "on what you do with the truth." Robert shook his head. "I don't even know what the truth is anymore. My whole life, he was Edmund, my uncle, a war hero, head of the family, and now he's just a fraud." "He was all of those things," said Wimsey, "except one. He was your uncle in his way. He was the head of your family. He did serve in the war, though not as Edmund. Men contain contradictions, Mr. Bedlington. The best of us are guilty of masks, the worst of us are made of them." Robert's voice trembled. "He killed someone." "Yes," said Wimsey, "and he died for it, long before last week. He spent his years walking in borrowed footsteps, never quite daring to make his own." There was silence then, broken only by the cooing of a distant pigeon in the loft above. Robert turned at last, looking Wimsey full in the face. "Will they take the estate?" "Perhaps," Wimsey said honestly. "The law is not kind to forgeries, especially not those that inherit property. But there are mitigating circumstances, and I've a suspicion Tolliver doesn't wish to see Bedlington in scandal. No one really does. The aristocracy has its own way of closing ranks." He touched the brim of his hat. "But you, Mr. Bedlington, will have to decide if this place is worth rebuilding. Not in name, in truth." Robert gave a single nod. "I'll try." "That," said Wimsey, "is all the best of us ever manage." By dusk, Wimsey and Bunter were packed and waiting at the gravel drive. The rolls purred beneath them. Miss Felversham came to see them off, a silk scarf knotted around her throat, her expression unreadable. "You leave us in ashes," she said softly. "I leave you with the truth," Wimsey replied. "What you build from it is no concern of mine, but I dare say it's the strongest foundation there is." She reached through the window and touched his hand once, briefly. "Thank you." And then they were gone, the car easing down the winding lane beneath trees heavy with the coming of autumn. The journey back to London passed in a grey quietude, the countryside slipping by like the turning of a worn page. Lord Peter Wimsey reclined with his hat lowered over his brow, not sleeping, but sunk in that particular state of active repose that allowed his mind to rove through shadows and significance. Bunter, ever discreet, did not interrupt. Only when they crossed the Thames into the smoke-creased sprawl of the city did Wimsey stir. "There's a particular melancholy," he murmured, "in watching men bury themselves in borrowed identities. One begins in costume and ends in camouflage." Bunter nodded faintly. "A tragedy built of well-cut lies, my lord." Wimsey's lips curved. "Well-cut, yes, but ill-tailored to reality. In the end, it frays." At 110A, Piccadilly, the familiar smell of beeswax, leather, and old books greeted them. Miss Climpson had sent a note ahead which awaited Wimsey on the console table. He opened it without removing his gloves. "My dear Lord Peter, you were right about the will. The original was never filed with the family solicitor. I have located a curious duplicate in the register office, dated months after Edmund's alleged death, and bearing a signature that most certainly matches Lionel Treville on his old actor's contract. It appears he made his own inheritance airtight. Yours in ink and subterfuge, Miss C." Wimsey gave a low whistle and passed the note to Bunter. So he forged not only a life but its legacy? "Remarkably thorough," Bunter said. "Yes, but in the end, all traps catch something, even if it's the man who laid them." He wandered into the study and poured a measure of Armagnac, holding it up to the firelight, watching it glow. "Let's consider the balance, Bunter. A man abandons his own name, adopts another's, survives the war under false pretenses, inherits a title through elegant forgery, lives 2 decades without suspicion, until a single stage-hand's memory sparks a quiet ruin. There's poetry in it, ugly poetry perhaps, but poetry all the same." Bunter, polishing a decanter, offered no reply. After a moment, Wimsey set down the glass, untasted. "I should speak with the real Edmund's niece, the one in Sussex, Miss Genevieve Hargreaves. She has written," Bunter said, producing another envelope. "Arrived this morning." Wimsey opened it, brow arching as he read. "Lord Peter, I received your letter. I knew something was wrong years ago, though I couldn't have told you what. Edmund was not a warm man, but he was precise, disciplined. The man who returned from the war looked like him, spoke like him, but never once mentioned home. He got dates wrong. He quoted poetry he never liked. I knew something had changed. Thank you for confirming it wasn't just grief that made me doubt. He was already dead by then, wasn't he? It frightens me, how easily we let lies nest in our lives. But I'm grateful to know the truth, even if it cost him his soul." G.H. Wimsey folded the paper slowly. "Do you think," he said after a long pause, "that one can mourn someone they never really knew?" Bunter looked up. "Yes, my lord, I imagine most people do." Wimsey smiled faintly. "That may be your most theological statement to date." The days that followed settled like dust. Bedlington House passed into the hands of a distant cousin from the Scottish line, quietly, without litigation. Robert Bedlington, relieved of inheritance, accepted a commission in India. Miss Felversham moved to Dorset. The blackmailer's body was claimed by no one. But the story refused to leave Wimsey's mind. It haunted the corners of the clubroom when the fire burned low. It crept behind his eyes in the quiet of libraries. A man had impersonated another and fooled the world. Yet, in the end, what he could not escape was himself. One cold evening, Wimsey dined with Inspector Tolliver at a small restaurant in Kensington. The case had left both men thinner, more thoughtful. "You were right," Tolliver said, toying with his fork. "The body in the pond, it was Lionel. Stabbed with the same pattern as the rehearsal knife, but at a deeper angle. Throat slit afterward. And the footprints, well, they weren't from any man now living." Wimsey sipped his wine. "A ghost story, then?" Tolliver gave a sharp look. "You don't believe in ghosts?" "No," Wimsey admitted, "but I believe in guilt and in madness, and sometimes I think they wear faces of the dead." Tolliver frowned. "You think Robert did it?" Wimsey shook his head. "Number nor Miss Felversham, nor the servants. It was Lionel himself, in a way. He walked too far into another man's skin and couldn't find his way out." "You think it was suicide?" "I think it was a reckoning. He knew the past was coming for him. The blackmailer. The truth. Perhaps even Edmund, in some twisted inner sense. He prepared a stage, wore his old uniform, played out a final act. Maybe he hoped to die as Edmund and be buried as him. Tolliver looked troubled. And the blood in the study? The torn curtain? A show, said Wimsey. The last scene of the last play, but real enough to matter, and deadly enough to ensure no encore. He paid the bill with absent-minded grace, rising from the table. Outside, London was hushed with cold and fog. A woman laughed somewhere beyond the lamplight. A carriage clattered by. Wimsey turned his collar against the wind. Strange, he said. How many men spend their lives trying to be someone else, when the real horror is being seen as they are? And with that, he vanished into the mist. The fog hung low over the twisting lanes of Bedlington underworld, as Lord Peter Wimsey made his final visit to the village, the place where the entire drama had first stirred like a shadow at dusk. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a perfect theatre for secrets long buried to stage their reluctant reappearance. Wimsey paused outside the modest vicarage, where Reverend Pritchard, a man more given to pastoral comforts than detective work, awaited him with an expression that combined relief and a touch of suspicion. "I trust you found what you sought, my lord?" the Reverend inquired, adjusting his thin spectacles. In a manner of speaking, Wimsey replied, his tone lightly arching as always. "Truth, Reverend, is a shapeshifter, often resembling a shadow at the edges of our vision, until we choose to confront it directly." Their conversation quickly turned to the curious behaviours noted among the villagers, the hushed whispers about the Bedlington family, the late-night wanderings, and the strange, echoing footsteps in the labyrinth of hedges surrounding the estate. Wimsey's observations were as precise as ever, drawing out contradictions between the villagers' accounts and the physical evidence gathered over weeks. The gardener's boy mentioned a man in a velvet coat, Wimsey mused, and yet no such visitor was officially recorded. But velvet, my dear Reverend, is an odd choice for a casual stroll in November. Reverend Pritchard nodded, recalling a vague unease that had settled over the village since the news of Edmund's death. Aye, and it was said the hand found in the orchard bore traces of some theatrical powder, a curious detail to be sure. "Indeed," Wimsey said, his eyes gleaming faintly with a mixture of irony and satisfaction. For the final act in this drama was not a ghost, nor a stroke of the supernatural, but a man playing a role with such zeal that he became the very character he impersonated. He recounted the intricate web of forged letters, assumed identities, and the ultimate revelation. Lionel Hargreaves, the disgraced actor, had masqueraded as his brother Edmund Bedlington, weaving a tapestry of deception to claim a life and legacy not his own. But the store question remains, Wimsey concluded. Why kill the blackmailer, and what made the man who died twice finally meet his end? The answer lay in pride, desperation, and the fragile artifice of identity. Lionel, trapped within his own performance, saw the blackmailer as a threat not merely to his fortune, but to the carefully constructed persona that was his refuge from disgrace. The murder was a tragic consequence of a man's fear of exposure, a final fatal line drawn in the shadows of Bedlington Hall. Wimsey smiled, a faint curl of his lips betraying a rare softness. "The ghosts we fear are rarely spirits, Reverend. They are the lies we tell ourselves and the faces we wear to hide the ones we dare not be." As he took his leave, the village seemed to breathe a little easier, though its quiet carried the weight of a story that would linger like a whispered caution for years to come. Boarding his carriage, Wimsey cast one last glance back at the stately but haunted Bedlington Hall, its windows darkened, its secrets finally laid bare. "Truth," he murmured, "is the cruelest of lights, yet in its glare we find freedom, even if it comes with a price." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey vanished into the mist, leaving behind a tale of identity, deception, and the enduring human yearning to be seen, truly seen, for who we are.